What is causing the hesitancy from the consumer side? Is this, they're not having a consumer spending power, or is there actually this power that they have, but there's not enough tourism destinations, or there's, the RT-PCR thing costs that are still making them hesitant? And how are you addressing these bottlenecks from the consumer end?
Well, let me break it down into two categories of consumers. First, the foreign travelers. So clearly, because of the travel, the entry restrictions, many foreigners, even if they want to come to the Philippines, are not able to do so. But based on our consultations with our travel trade partners, the operators, the airlines, the agents, there is still a strong demand for these foreigners to come to the Philippines. With respect to Filipino travelers, the local market, we've had a couple of surveys conducted last year. And the good thing that came out of it is that the appetite for travel is still very strong. 70, 80, 85% of Filipinos are still willing to travel even during the pandemic. And a very high percentage, about 90, 95%, said that they're willing to comply with the minimum health protocols. So the demand is there, the appetite is there. I think when you
Sir,
talk
can you
about...
clarify, this is domestic travel? They're willing to travel domestically or abroad?
Well, we're talking about domestically.
Domestic travel.
We're talking about domestic travel. So the demand is still there. The preference, as to be expected, has changed slightly. The consumers will be opting for more open air, well ventilated kinds of tourism activities. So we will see stronger demand for, of course, the beaches, the mountains, and even the special interests like motorbikes and bicycles. And in terms of traveling, many of them will be moving around with their families. Of course, they've been together, locked up in their households for the last several months. So it provides some kind of assurance that they know the medical condition of one another. But overall, the demand is still there. In the case of the DOT, we're trying to encourage movement by making it easier for them to move around. And one example that I can mention here is that the DOT, through the Tourism Promotions Board, continues to provide subsidy for qualified domestic tourists for their RT-PCR testing.
Okay. Sir, do you have any sort of studies in your department which can assure consumers that traveling is already safe at this point in time? Are you able to illustrate that, with the specific protocols, the spread of COVID has not been due to tourism?
Well, we have not conducted a formal study in this regard, but based on initial reports that we have obtained from our regional offices, none of the cases can be directly attributed to tourism. Remember, in the opening up of our destinations, many LGUs, at least initially, required a negative RT-PCR test result. And even to this day, many destinations continue to require that. So that's one way of ensuring that only those who are clear are allowed to travel to the destinations that have reopened. On the supply side, we're very strict in monitoring the operations of the DOT accredited establishments.
Sir, vaccination and quarantine, how likely is this to happen, that any fully vaccinated tourist does not have to quarantine in the Philippines? Which countries, for example, are you looking at, to pattern what the IATF and what you're, recommending in terms of tourism for foreign arrivals here in the Philippines? And is there a level of inoculation or percentage of the population that needs to happen before this can take place?
There was a small working group that was created by the IATF to study the protocols for incoming passengers who have been inoculated. And the small working group came up with its proposal, broken down into three phases. The first phase basically involves providing a green lane, the so-called green lane, for those who have been inoculated here in the Philippines. So for those who have been vaccinated here and those documents have been authenticated, when they return to the Philippines, instead of doing the 10-day quarantine period, they will only do 7 days. The second phase of the proposal will now involve authenticating and recognizing certificates for vaccinations that were made abroad. So, for example, if you're a Filipino or PhilAm or an OFW inoculated either in the US or in the Middle East, we will try to find or to develop a system that will authenticate and recognize such certificates so that in the future they may also be allowed some kind of a reduced quarantine. But again, I have to mention that this is still being evaluated. What has been approved by the IATF is what I mentioned under phase one. There's a third phase that was presented to the work to the IATF, and this is still for discussion, but this basically involves what we refer to as travel bubbles, meaning containing the movement of foreigners coming from a country where the COVID-19 has been contained and where they have a high inoculation rate, and then bringing them to a destination where health and safety protocols can be assured and where there is also a high level of vaccination among the locals.
Even before the pandemic, we were lagging behind our ASEAN neighbors in terms of tourism, and this was something that we were actively trying to promote. Of course, how do we become competitive now? You mentioned travel bubbles. Are there some sort of bilateral agreements that will allow for us to benefit when the rest of global tourism gets underway?
Well, I will not quite agree with the word lagging, no, because if you look at the figures, if you look at the growth rate of inbound arrivals to the Philippines over the 5-year period prior to the pandemic, 2014 to 2019, our growth rate was about 8%. This is higher than the Asian average of about 5-6%, and higher than the global average of about 3 to 4%. So in terms of average growth rate, we did better than most of our neighbors. But moving forward, what's really important is how to accelerate the recovery of tourism. And what is going to be key here would be how well we're able to tap into the local market, the domestic market. Many do not know that the Philippines is one of the largest domestic tourism markets in the region. In 2019, we had 110 million domestic trips that resulted in a revenue of over 3 trillion pesos. And we strongly feel that in the next several months, it will really be domestic tourists that will help keep many of our enterprises afloat. So as we slowly but surely reopen our destinations, it's very important that we encourage our kababayans to responsibly travel and support tourism, especially at the community level.